Los Angeles' famous playboy Henry has a change of heart and is willing to settle down for me. Until one day, I saw him sitting at a booth, letting a woman feed him alcohol. He laughed without a care in the world, while I was chasing after Wendy, just because of a bet. I am Wendy. 1 year later, I appeared in front of him as Henry's sister-in-law. At night, he pushed me against the French window, his voice cold. Does my brother know that you were my first love? I stood in the cold wind, waiting for Henry at the school gate for an hour. After countless ignored calls, he finally picked up. Henry, aren't you here yet? There was the sound of a lighter flicking on the other end. Henry was probably smoking, his words not very clear. Sorry, forgot you wanted to meet. Are you still at school? Yes. There was too much noise on the phone. I couldn't help but ask, where are you? He chuckled lightly. Are you trying to keep tabs on me? Henry's voice was slow and cold. Enough, Wendy, you've crossed the line. Without giving me a chance to speak, he hung up the phone straight away. I was frozen. Recently, Henry was acting very differently, distant to the point of being unrecognizable from the one who used to chase after me. I accidentally clicked on his social media profile. 10 minutes ago, Henry's brother posted a video with a location tag. Henry was sitting at a booth, the phone beside him kept lighting up with my calls. He just glanced at it casually, unfazed. Determined to clarify things even if it meant breaking up, I decided to take a cab there. The dim lights of the bar were hazy. Henry lazily leaned against the booth, letting the woman in his arms feed him alcohol. Trying to provoke me, right? I stood not too far away, watching as Henry lifted the woman's chin and asked with a smile. She playfully punched his shoulder. Am I worthy? You have a girlfriend after all. Henry lowered his head to kiss her lips. After the kiss, he pressed the woman into his arms. I chased Wendy just for a bet. I won the bet, so of course, I dumped her. Really, did you think I liked her? The woman playfully asked. Then who do you like? Henry's eyes were ambiguous. Tonight, I like you the most. Before I realized it, I was standing in front of them. Who are you looking for, little girl? The woman's voice was coquettish. Henry was sitting in the flashing lights, his expression unclear. Henry, you make me sick. I picked up a drink and poured it on his face, my voice trembling uncontrollably. The woman screamed and went to wipe Henry's face. He pushed her away, stood up, and walked towards me. The yellow liquid trickled down from his jawline. Did everyone hear that? He chuckled, patting his cheek. I stared at him intensely, wanting to slap him, but he held my hand. In the next second, he let go of my hand, his expression indifferent. You disgust me, but you still like me. What's wrong with you, Wendy? Are you being a masochist? I clenched my teeth, refusing to cry in front of him. Henry leaned in close to me, patted my face lightly. Look at yourself now, stop embarrassing yourself. He didn't give me a chance to argue or retaliate. He stood up straight and signaled the security guard. Escort her out. I was pushed out of the bar. Standing there, it took me a while to come back to my senses. Laughter and joy surrounded me, but I felt like I was in an ice cellar. My vision gradually blurred. I sniffed and wiped away the tears that hadn't fallen yet. Silently, I walked into the snowy night. I thought from then on, I would have no more dealings with Henry. Until 2 months later, my father suggested that I marry in order to save our struggling family business. The prospective groom was none other than Henry, the second son of the Booth family. Only Booth Group could save us. Wendy, please help Dad. I wanted to tell him that Henry was really bad. He had bullied me before, and I didn't like him at all. I knew that if I spoke up, my father wouldn't force me. But he would be left to bear a huge debt alone. Coupled with his declining health and graying temples, I couldn't bring myself to refuse. I knew Henry didn't like me. I had already despised him since that day in the bar. But I never expected him to not let me go, and to humiliate me in public. Because on the day of the wedding, Henry disappeared. What's going on? Did the groom run away? Yeah, he must not have liked the Smiths girl, that's why he ran away. I stood on the stage, forced to endure the pity and mockery of the guests. It was the first time I felt so helpless. Until Eric, the current head of Booth Group, stood in front of me. Grandfather Booth stood up and addressed the guests. The invitations were mistakenly written by the staff. The groom was supposed to be Eric, not Henry. Let the wedding proceed. Please remain calm. The audience was left speechless. Grandfather Booth's justification was weak and full of holes. But in the city's business circles, even the Jiang family, if they called a deer a horse, few dared to question it. I stared at Eric in a daze. He lifted my hand and put a ring on my finger. Slow to react, I finally did the same for him. The final part of the wedding, the kiss. Eric looked at me, his hand on my waist. Close your eyes. His voice calmed. I instinctively followed his words. The next moment, a light kiss landed on my lips. Sparse applause rang out from the audience. And just like that, I was married off to another man in a daze. I thought I had become numb until that night. On our wedding night, in a huge mansion, just Eric and me. I couldn't help but feel scared about what was about to happen tonight. After all, I was about to share a bed with someone who was practically a stranger. When Eric came out of the bathroom in his pajamas, I pretended to be asleep under the covers, listening to a series of shuffling noises. Eric laid down on the bed, not too close to me, and didn't make any moves. He was the one who could save my father's company. I didn't want to anger him. Steeling myself, I slowly approached him. The moment our hands touched, he made a sudden move. He flipped me onto the bed, pressing me under the duvet. I shivered. Eric sensed it. In the silent air. A light chuckle sounded. He hovered above me, looking directly into my eyes. Why are you getting closer when you're scared? Feeling his hand slightly tighten around my wrist, I realized my prolonged silence was making Eric unsure. He let go of me, about to lie back beside me. I reached out and clung to his shoulder, whispering softly. I don't know what to do. I'm just a bit scared, not rejecting you. Although he was Henry's brother, it wasn't about that. It was simply because he was a stranger. The man in front of me was the lifeline saving my family's company, and my new husband. Eric's hand slowly moved down, stroking at the hem of my dress. It seemed like he was about to explore. Just relax a bit. He leaned close to my ear, speaking softly. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to relax. The pain felt like tearing. I could sense Eric going slow. He lightly kissed my cheek. Is that okay? I steadied my breath. Yes. His smile continued as the kisses gradually moved downward. The next morning, the light of the day filled the room. In that vast bedroom, there was only me. As I washed up and came out, Eric was sitting at the dining table. Mr. Booth, I still habitually addressed him. He looked up. Are you uncomfortable? I blinked, my ears turning crimson. No. But soon, the little lie I told was exposed. I need to go back to school this afternoon to pack up. Eric happens to be going to the office, so he'll give me a ride. As soon as we stepped out, my legs felt weak for a moment. I almost stumbled. Eric caught me in time, picking me up effortlessly. I thought you weren't feeling uncomfortable anymore. He looked down at me with an amused lip. I blushed, burying my face in his neck, avoiding his gaze. Inside the car, he didn't put me down. Instead, he kept me sitting on his lap. His hand rested on my waist. Is your waist sore? The driver was in front, and he deliberately lowered his voice, leaning close to my ear. I felt like my ears could have been roasted like a sweet potato by now. Eric urged. A bit. My voice was even softer than his. He smiled meaninglessly and continued massaging. Next time, put a cushion under your waist. By now, I felt like my whole body could be roasted like a sweet potato. On Monday, the Civil Affairs Bureau opened. Eric and I went to pick up our marriage certificate. It was then that I found out the head of the Booth Group wasn't just young looking. He was actually young. Only 27 years old, yet he held a high position. My father was thrilled and urged me to bring Eric home for dinner. It seemed like the company had some room for recovery. My father was so happy, he insisted Eric drink a lot. Eric, have a few more drinks with me, stay tonight, don't rush to leave. Eric didn't say much, just kept drinking one glass after another. The consequence was, at night, even as he came out of the bathroom, the drunkenness in his eyes became more apparent. A drunk Eric was very different from the usual Eric. I leaned against the bedpost, watching him with eyes darker than usual, feeling a bit uneasy. Eric walked straight towards me and suddenly lifted me up like he was carrying a child. Holding me close, I blinked, my mind blanking out, and involuntarily asked, "Do you want to do it here?" Eric moved closer to my lips, nibbling my nose affectionately. "Can I?" It wasn't until halfway through that I started to regret. I bit my fingertips, too afraid to make a sound. "Why aren't you speaking?" Eric stood behind me, his movements relentless. Speak. I took a deep breath before slowly speaking up. My parents' room is next door. Eric chuckled lightly and turned me around in his arms. Is it? Honey, you better be able to control yourself. This was the first time Eric called me honey. That night, to prevent any noise from escaping, I left several teeth marks on Eric's shoulder. Initially, I thought that regardless of the bride-to-be, Eric would behave the same way. Later, I found out that he was a severe germaphobe. For 27 years, he had never given any woman the opportunity. Eric would come pick me up from school whenever he had time. We were still at the stage of doing more and saying less. Perhaps it was also because Eric himself was a man of few words. But seemingly, in an invisible way, the relationship between him and me was gradually getting closer. Just when I started to feel a little bit of affection for Eric, Henry came back. On the day of the welcome dinner for Henry's return, I was still at school. After school, I waited for Eric while drinking peach-flavored tea. When I saw his car, I had just finished my drink. As soon as I got in the car, he leaned over. Pinching my chin, he swallowed the air from my mouth. I hesitated for a moment before closing my eyes to accept it. Eric didn't back away for a long time. Did you eat peaches just now? I hesitated to meet his gaze. More or less. Eric's finger brushed against my lips. Are you nervous about seeing Henry soon? Will you be scared? I gripped onto my sense of security, pursing my lips without saying a word. Indeed, I was a little scared. But what I was afraid of was when Henry came back, he might mention the past to Eric. I was afraid that Eric would mind that Henry and I had been together before. Seeing me silent, Eric seemed to have misunderstood. He raised his hands to tuck my hair behind my ear, rubbing my earlobe. If you're really uncomfortable, we don't have to go, okay? I immediately regained my senses and tentatively kissed his chin. I'm fine. Seeing that I insisted, Eric didn't say anything else and started the car. When we arrived at the destination, Eric didn't rush to get out of the car. He leaned over again, as if to kiss me once more. He was always like this, wanting to kiss a few times when getting in and out of the car. Suddenly, the car window was knocked, interrupting the kiss. Eric, is this my sister-in-law? Henry, who had been gone for 3 months, suddenly appeared in front of me. He looked at me meaningfully over Eric's shoulder, his eyes unusually cold. At the banquet, whether intentional or unintentional, Henry didn't sit next to the host. Instead, he took a seat next to me. He stared straight at me, but directed his words to Eric. Eric, your sister-in-law is really beautiful. The polite chatter between the elderly in the private room drowned out Henry's voice, preventing everyone from hearing. I nervously looked at Eric. I had never told him about my past with Henry. But Eric's expression didn't change one bit. He smiled, without any hint of disturbance. Of course, she is your sister-in-law. Henry chuckled, then turned his gaze to me. Sister-in-law, have you ever been in a relationship before? I froze, moved my lips, but couldn't answer. Thankfully. Grandfather Booth finished his pleasantries just in time to hear. Henry, watch your manners in front of your sister-in-law. The topic ended there. Eric didn't show any abnormal reactions. His tone when talking to me remained gentle, occasionally offering me food. But on the other hand, Henry's gaze was overly intense. Feeling breathless, I excused myself to go outside for some fresh air. Lost in thought, I was suddenly pulled into a room next to me. Henry didn't turn on the light, he pressed me against the floor-to-ceiling window. Did you do anything with him? He asked hoarsely. It's none of your business. I furrowed my brows and struggled, feeling a mixture of disgust and repulsion towards his touch, both physically and mentally. But he paid no heed to my words, because he had already seen the red mark behind my ear. Henry's face turned unbelievably dark. Do you believe I can make you mine right here, my sister-in-law? His deep, ominous voice made me shiver. Henry, don't disgust me. I'm afraid of getting sick, I said, slightly trembling. Henry sneered, is it because you want to protect Eric's reputation, huh? Do you really think he's a good guy? His next words stunned me. Do you think I ran away from the wedding on purpose? I'll tell you, I didn't intentionally leave you stranded at the wedding. It was Eric who had me abducted and sent abroad. You can marry him perfectly, but it's actually been his long-term plan. I stopped struggling and stared at him without blinking. Just then, the door was pushed open. Light flooded in, illuminating the room. I looked up to see Eric standing backlit. His tone remained gentle as always. But at this moment, I felt a chill creeping in. What are you two doing? Henry slowly let go of me, meeting Eric's gaze. With his hands in his pockets, he looked relaxed. My sister-in-law and I know each other from before. We're just catching up, Eric. Hope you don't mind. Eric approached, smiling as he turned his gaze towards me. Is that so? I let out a deep breath. Yes, the elders of the Booth family were still in the private room next door. Now is definitely not a good time to reveal everything. Eric held my hand and led me back to the room, looking as calm as ever. He seemed not to have heard the conversation between Henry and me. It wasn't until the driver parked the car back at the estate's parking lot. You go ahead. Eric's tone was very light, speaking to the driver. With the sound of the car door locking, there were only the two of us left inside the car. I tried to sit a bit further away from him. Just then, Eric suddenly lifted me up. Sitting face to face on his lap, I instinctively tried to break free. What are you doing? Eric pressed down on my waist. His gaze was dark, his emotions hard to discern. Why are you rejecting me? He smiled gently, but his voice carried a sense of coldness. Eric, are you afraid? He smiled and asked, because Henry told you some bad things today, and you believed him. So now you're scared. It was strange. Facing the silent, emotionally reserved Eric just now, I did feel a bit of unfamiliar fear. But now, seeing Eric clearly suppressing his anger, I felt calm instead. After a moment of contemplation, I chose to be honest with Eric. I didn't believe him, but I did have some doubts. So, did you really do those things? Eric raised an eyebrow lightly, seemingly surprised by my sudden calmness. He opened the car door and carried me up to the elevator in that position. As the elevator doors closed, he kissed my lips. As our lips intertwined, I heard his soft murmur, yes. I was still immersed in the reasoning that if Eric had done those bad things, then he must be a bad person, and that I had developed a crush on a bad guy. The elevator doors opened. Eric held me with one arm and thoughtfully wiped a stain at the corner of my lip with the other. I blinked and looked past him. I had never been to the 4th floor. I gasped, but shockingly couldn't make a sound. Behind Eric was a huge semicircular birdcage. It was big enough to sleep one person. The birdcage was made of pure silver, with intricate carvings on the bars and a white velvet carpet underneath. I didn't realize when Eric had already put me down. He embraced me from behind, placing a kiss on my earlobe. Do you like it? I trembled for a moment, forgetting to beat around the bush, and just asked directly. Are you planning to lock me inside this? He chuckled softly in my ear. Of course not. I breathed a sigh of relief. This is for both of us to share. I raised my voice a bit. What do you mean? Eric opened the door to the birdcage. Taking my hand, he led me inside. Henry deserved to be sent away. I'll explain it to you slowly. Now, grab onto the bars. I grasped the bars with both hands and looked at him puzzled. Eric's hand slipped from his sleeve and caressed my collarbone. He chuckled softly and asked, if you didn't want it in the car, how about here? After a while, I finally understood why Eric had me grab onto the bars. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to support myself. Eric stood behind me. His breathing was calm as he spoke. Henry owed a gambling debt in Las Vegas, and the wedding day was his deadline for repayment. He paused for a moment, his hand on my waist. Leaning over, he planted light kisses on my shoulder. Will your back feel sore like this? I bit my lip and didn't answer. He applied pressure. Is it okay? I tightened my grip on the bars. Eric smiled faintly and continued to explain, I just made a phone call to the casino management. The debt belongs to Henry, and the people they have are his doing. Henry just wants to pin all the blame on me with a few words. I casually nodded in agreement, my head feeling heavy. All I knew was that he had explained it clearly. I pushed his hand away again. Your ring is poking me. Eric's hand snaked up and finally intertwined with mine. His hand enveloped mine and my hand gripped the railing. And that was it. He readjusted slightly. That day, Eric seemed like a different person. I almost felt released only when the dawn broke. I even forgot to ask. What was his purpose in doing this? And what did Henry mean by that sentence, you can marry him brazenly, in fact? It's been his plan all along? These questions were forgotten amidst the tightly packed schedule. The next day, Grandfather Booth suggested going to Las Vegas. It was his birthday a week later, and he chose that location simply because Henry wanted to go. Grandfather Booth had always indulged him. 3 nights later, on the cruise ship, I was on deck with Eric. Why are you here? You never accompany me for shopping. A coquettish voice accompanied by approaching footsteps. Henry and his companion walked towards us. The companion was the woman who fed Henry drinks mouth to mouth at the bar that night. Long time no see, she said meaningfully, raising her eyebrows at me. I shifted my gaze away and ignored her insincere attentions. Eric's expression remained unchanged. Though he didn't say anything, I could guess that he knew about my past with Henry. Henry stared straight at me, pulling the companion into his arms. An air of swagger crept into his smile. Can't you see she's not interested? Why bother trying to act so attentive? Both Eric and I ignored his snide remarks. Just then, a gust of sea breeze made me shiver. Eric draped his coat over me and tightened it. Feeling cold? Want to go back inside? Before I could respond, Henry interrupted. What's the rush? He drawled, cocking his head towards Eric, a hint of provocation in his gaze. Eric, care for a game? He asked, signaling towards Las Vegas, the only legal gambling zone in the U.S., with the ship's own gaming tables below. Henry and Eric sat at opposite ends of a long table. Henry flicked through the playing cards with one hand, then pushed all his chips away from him. Adding Grandfather Booth's entire holdings. He gave me real estate. All in. Eric smiled, but remained silent, waiting for his next move. Henry's gaze shifted to me. He raised his chin. I want her. The air hung still. The atmosphere was tense, but Henry seemed unaffected. He continued in a relaxed tone, Eric, just want to tell you up front, I've set my eyes on your wife. Care to gamble? I furrowed my brows. Henry, are you out of your mind? Eric casually moved the chips in front of him, lips curved in a leisurely smile. Apologies. Wendy belongs to herself, I have no right to decide her fate. His refusal was civil. Even in that moment, I looked at Eric, feeling like I was falling for him even more. No, actually, falling for him a lot more. Eric stood up and walked over to Henry's stony face. From the cards in front of him, he randomly pulled out 3 and turned them over, placing them in front of Henry. A straight flush. He declined Henry's invitation but used this gesture to indirectly tell Henry that he didn't view his supposed provocation seriously. Henry gritted his teeth, silent. I took Eric's hand when he extended it towards me, and we left. Suppressing the smile that tugged at my lips. My husband is so handsome. As we returned to the room, I was about to praise him when my breath caught. He was too tall. I couldn't reach his lips easily. Sensing this, Eric lifted me higher by my waist to help me kiss him. Did my words on the gambling table please you? He asked, not moving too far away, kissing me again once he was done speaking. I nodded. But that wasn't my true thoughts. Eric held me close. When he spoke to me, his tone was always gentle. Wendy, you have absolute freedom here with me. But the condition is, you are mine. That idiot, why would he think I would stake you in a bet? I remained silent for a few seconds before accepting Eric's words. This was truly Eric. Polite on the surface, but with a twisted mind inside. Some fetishes were twisted too. I thought Henry's embarrassment the night before would make him more restrained. Little did I know he would become more insane because of it. Early the next morning, Eric gave me a few instructions by my ear, then planted a kiss on my forehead before heading to handle the results of the report in the Ohio branch. When I woke up again, Henry sitting on the nearby couch startled me back to reality. How did you get in? I pulled the blanket around me, sitting upright. Henry stood up and walked towards me with casual strides. I was about to call for help, but he saw through my intent and scoffed. If you don't want things to escalate, it's better not to call for help, he said, standing by the bed, looking down at me. Wendy, tell me, why, knowing that Eric would go to any lengths to marry you, do you still choose to stay by his side? You've, he said, fallen for him, haven't you? I sat on the other end of the bed, keeping my distance from him. Eric is my husband, why can't I like him? Henry's voice softened. Just 5 months ago, you still liked me. Why is it that in less than half a year, you could immediately start liking someone else? Wendy, is your affection given so easily? I took a deep breath, holding back impatience. Yes, my affection is given easily, and taken back just as easily. Until the moment I saw you kissing someone else at the bar, and heard that you pursued me only for a bet, I liked you. From that moment on, I took back all my affection. Because you're not deserving of it. Henry suddenly broke down, speaking rapidly. Damn it! I admit it. Initially, I did pursue you just to play around. That was my mindset in every relationship. But I don't know when it happened, I started liking you. When we first broke up, I was nonchalant about it. I shook my head, smiling gently, but finding it grating. Are you not believing it? Wendy, what I'm saying is true. When grandfather told me about the arranged marriage, I rejected it without a second thought. Only when I heard it was you, my first reaction was, if it's you, I wouldn't resist marriage that much. I realized then, I genuinely liked you. I started looking forward to our wedding. But all of this got ruined by Eric. If it weren't for him, I cut him off. If it weren't for him, every day of being married to you would be living in disgust and self-loathing. Henry, you're just. Eric may also find him annoying, and covered my ears. But I could still hear vaguely. The man's tone was slow and full of interest. Don't like it? Today happens to be Children's Day. This is the Children's Day gift I bought for you. I thought you would like it. Henry looked gloomy. Just as he wanted to say something, Eric's bodyguard escorted him out. Although it was satisfying to see Henry frustrated, due to Eric not notifying me in advance and scaring me, I still had a 3-day Cold War with Eric. On the evening of the third day, I was forced to make peace. Eric is too much of a pervert. How could he even kiss? I stared at his lips stained with water. Go brush your teeth. Don't even think about kissing me again in the future, I shouted at him in frustration. But Eric quickly rejected my demand. Even later, when the waiter brought a plate of fruit, he only picked peaches to eat. Then shamelessly looked at me. Wendy, do I look like one? When the waiter came to collect the fruit plate again, Eric smiled and tipped him. The peaches are not bad. The waiter hastened to agree. Yes sir, all the peaches we selected are very sweet and juicy. Eric rarely chuckled. When he seemed like he was about to speak again, I immediately covered his mouth. The waiter left with a strange look on his face. I then gave in and said, okay, I forgive you. Stop mentioning peaches. Henry did not stay put for a few days. In other words, Henry, this kind of person, is also stubborn to the core. What is decided must be done. Those who are determined must also be obtained. After returning from Las Vegas to the country, I finally figured out the relationship between Henry and Eric. That day, Eric and I were called back to the Jiang family's main house. Grandfather Booth was even more amiable than usual. After chatting for half an hour, he finally got to the point. Eric, Wendy, you two have only been married for half a year. When I let two people who hadn't even met each other get married, it was purely out of helplessness. I was still puzzled. Eric seemed to have understood something, his grip on my hand even stronger. Wendy was originally supposed to marry Henry. Now that he has returned, if you don't have any feelings for each other, it was too absurd. Today he actually acted as Henry's advocate, urging me and Eric to divorce and then marry Henry. Henry is absurd, and he is following the absurdity. I maintained a polite smile and interrupted him impolitely. Grandfather, Eric and I are doing well now. Grandfather Booth was left speechless. There was a figure moving on the second floor. I looked up. Henry, dressed in black casual clothes, was leaning against the railing on the second floor, tossing an apple back and forth. He still had earphones around his neck, looking confidently as if saying, what he wants, he can get. Grandfather Booth had no choice but to turn his gaze to Eric. Using a skilled moral coercion. Eric, you know, the Booths have never mistreated you, but we owe Henry. Eric remained silent, his expression restrained. Grandfather Booth sighed. You'd better think about it. Back in our own home, I pestered Eric to tell me about the past. When Henry was 2 years old, he went missing. His parents were inconsolable as they searched in vain, plus Henry's mother couldn't conceive anymore. A year later, the couple decided to adopt a child from a welfare home. That child was Eric. Initially when he arrived, everyone treated him as their own child. They seemed to want to make up for Henry's absence through Eric. But when Henry was 5, he was coincidentally found and brought back. From then on, Eric began to be ignored. It was as if everyone forgot about Eric. Eric fell out of favor overnight, and even because Henry rejected him, others began to avoid him too. But at the same time, Eric couldn't show any emotions resisting this treatment. He was constantly reminded that without them, he would still be in the welfare home living a hard life. Without them, he wouldn't have his current status. Later, Grandfather Booth started grooming Eric as the heir, only because Henry was not interested in the Booth group. They had no one to pass it on to. So, Grandfather Booth finally remembered his eldest grandson, Eric. While he was being molded rigorously, he was also being closely monitored. After all, he was an outsider, and they feared that Eric would eventually swallow the company on his own. The current Eric may seem to be in control, but in reality, he is being restricted in every way. Like today when Grandfather Booth used moral coercion to pressure him, it was a common occurrence. So, Eric? I'm now more courageous and dare to call his name out directly. Do you want to divorce me? For the debts owed to Henry by the Booths. Eric sat on the couch beside me and asked back, do you want to divorce me? I felt a bit wronged. I climbed onto Eric's lap and buried my face in his neck. In a small voice, I said, I don't want to. Eric hugged me back, pressing me into his chest. I nuzzled his neck as a sign of contentment. Suddenly, I remembered the question I had not asked yet. I lifted my head from his neck. Eric, did you like me before we got married? Eric chuckled softly and kissed my cheek. What do you want to ask? I tried to hold back my shyness, gazing intently at him. When did you start liking me? When Eric started liking me, I was still Henry's girlfriend. When Henry and I talked on the phone and video calls, there was often no avoidance of Eric. So, he had heard my voice and seen me through the screen. He said I was different from Henry's previous girlfriends. I was too serious. Compared to the nonchalant Henry, I would surely end up at a disadvantage in this relationship. He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when he started liking me. It was only in the shattered reality that he slowly pieced together an image of me in his imagination. It was only when he saw me for the first time that he realized. Every deliberate attention was his way of showing his affection. How Eric refused Grandfather Booth's proposal and eventually broke free from the Booths' control. He didn't tell me any details about it. There may have been dark methods involved. But I wouldn't waver in my liking for Eric because of that. The years of neglect and harsh treatment they gave him made his youth a time of no ease even outside the welfare home. While they ushered him into high society, broadened his horizons, and educated him, it wasn't until he worked tirelessly for the company, securing its position as a leading enterprise in the city, that he repaid it all. When almost everything had calmed down, Henry disappeared. No one paid much attention to his whereabouts, thinking he had gone off to enjoy some luxuries again. It wasn't until a month later that he suddenly reappeared. On the last day before summer vacation, I was packing and waiting for Eric by the roadside. In the evening, with few people around the school, someone patted my shoulder. I turned around. Henry. The next moment, I was forcefully silenced, with a damp cloth covering my mouth and nose. This was all I remembered before losing consciousness. When I woke up again, I was tied to the passenger seat and unable to move. Henry. The guy with the baseball cap turned the steering wheel with indifference. After not seeing you for a month. You seem to be doing better than I imagined. What are you going to do? I gradually calmed down, not daring to provoke him. The company is now Eric's, and I really don't care. I told you, I only want you. Grandfather can't help me, and he was planning to leave me abroad, never to return. So, I have to take you away myself. Where are we going? I asked. I bought an island with the money Grandfather gave me. Wendy. Despite acting as a hostage captor, Henry remained unexpectedly calm. Don't like him anymore. What Eric can give you, I can also. I was the first person you ever liked. If you leave him, I am confident that you will fall for me again. Henry, I can't like you again. Whether or not I am with Eric, it won't change. I tried to divert his attention. You've never figured out what our problem is. Henry raised his chin. Tell me. I saw you kissing another woman while we were dating. I can't get past that. It disgusts me. Henry took a deep breath and abruptly hit the steering wheel. Wendy, you're too old-fashioned. What era are we in? Are you still stuck on loyalty and fidelity? I've cut ties with everyone for you. Since the day I decided to marry you, I haven't been with anyone else. I calmly exposed his lie. In Las Vegas, the next morning, I saw the woman you kissed at the bar coming out of your room. Henry hit the steering wheel again. That was just that one time, I swear. That time, I was drunk. All right, Henry, are you trying to be interesting? I really don't care who you are still tangled up with. Then say it. Henry stared at me intensely. What do you want me to do? Let me go. That's not possible. Bastard, let's go down together. Just as the stalemate continued, Henry glanced at the rearview mirror. He immediately started the car, stepping on the gas pedal hard. Eric acted fast. He smirked and stepped on the gas pedal all the way. The speed was so fast that I started to feel a bit scared. There were 2 police cars following closely behind us. My face turned a bit pale, and Henry noticed he seemed to step on the brake. Then, his expression changed suddenly. I watched him repeatedly pressing the brakes, but the speed barely decreased. The floor mat was stuck on the gas pedal, and he couldn't brake properly. Henry. I felt chills all over, with cold sweat in my palms. It's okay, Wendy, it's okay. He tried to pull the handbrake again, and did something else. But the speed only increased, not decreased. There were consecutive sharp bends ahead. Without giving us time to think, we crashed straight into the trees outside the fence. My body was pressured and banged, but I think Henry must have been in more pain. Just before the crash, he unfastened his seatbelt and threw himself on top of me. Wendy. It was Eric's voice. I felt drowsy and couldn't move. I heard the sound of dripping water beside me. I smelled gasoline. The gas tank was leaking, and it seemed like the car was about to explode. Henry had completely lost consciousness. Just when I thought I was going to die there, Eric pushed aside the shattered glass and carried me out. A few seconds later, I heard the booming sound of an explosion behind us. In that car accident, I unexpectedly became the least injured one. Mostly scratches. On the other hand, Eric. Because the car exploded too close to him, he shielded me underneath him, and his right leg was injured by the blast. Even after the wound healed and he was discharged from the hospital, his mobility was still limited, requiring 3 months of thorough recovery. As for Henry, he was still in the intensive care unit. The doctors said at least his life was saved. And his sentence term was also going to be correspondingly postponed. When I heard that he survived, I breathed a sigh of relief. Eric noticed all these subtle changes. Wendy, are you worried about him? He leaned against the bedside, closing the book in his hands. I shook my head. He deserved it. You are lying here now because of him. I feel no sympathy for him. It's just, he did stand in front of me at the last moment. If he had died right there, I think I would have mixed feelings. Eric almost laughed. Thankfully he didn't die. I chuckled and leaned over to kiss him loudly. Wow, Eric. How did I not realize before? You're so petty. Eric turned to seek my lips. After a quiet kiss, his hand was already on my waist. Wendy. The tone of his voice was suggestive. I blinked, understanding. But, your leg isn't healed yet. His hand started moving upwards already. So, you'll have to help yourself. How? Sit up here. Eric reminded in a low voice. Moonlight poured onto the floor of the room, casting flickering shadows.